Hi, Prof. Clarence. Thank you for taking the time. We are Group 2, consisting of Russia, Esther, Nigel, Sheng, Julian, and myself, Jian. Our group is going to make a presentation on ethical analysis of the Luckin coffee fraud. Before we dive into such analysis, I will start things off by talking about the background of Luckin Coffee. It is basically a coffee company and coffee house chain which is very popular. It was founded in Beijing, China in June 2017 by then CEO Jenny Chen Ziya, with its headquarters being located in Xiamen. The company sells products such as coffee, tea, food, juices, and light meals, and utilizes technology with use of big data analytics and AI to analyze data from operations and seek improvement in its systems. For pleasant customers experience, their customers are allowed to order and pay for drinks using Luckin Coffee app. However, it has a turbulent past that many people are unaware about today. This is the corporate structure at the time of the occurrence of the accounting fraud. Jenny Chen Ziya being the CEO and director, Cars Lu Zhengya being the chairman. Forming the board of directors were Hui Li, Hai Liu, Sean Shao, and Thomas. Jian Liu being the CEO and director, Hendrik being the CFO and Chief Strategy Officer, Dr. Ji Guo being the VP of Product and Supply Chain and Director, Wen Baocao being the VP of Store Operations and Customer Service. Alongside several others, Jenny used to work under Klaus in a car rental company called Yuka, which was founded by the latter. After the events of the scandal, Dr. Ji Guo was eventually appointed as the acting CEO of Luckin Coffee. Next, I'll proceed with a summary of the scandal. I'll dive into the discussion of the scandal by splitting into three parts: pre-scandal, during scandal, and post-scandal. Before the scandal, the company began undergoing an exponential growth period in January 2018 when it became a preeminent coffee chain. During this growth period, its daily average store openings hit 5.2 per day. In the subsequent 14 months, company achieved unicorn status after its Series A fundraise, which secured $200 million of funds from GIC and prominent Chinese investment funds. An additional $350 million funding was secured in subsequent Series B and C from existing investors and globally renowned asset manager BlackRock. On 7 May 2019, Luckin Coffee went public and surpassed Starbucks when they started trading its shares on Nasdaq. The company experienced a share price surge in its IPO price from $17 to $25 before eventually closing at $20.38. Its share price eventually hit all-time high of $50, which represented a 190% increase from its initial IPO price. Moving on to the events taking place during the scandal, the uncovering process began when Muddy Waters Research received an anonymous 89-page report alleging massively inflated sales for the year ended 31st December 2019 and subsequently announced a short position on Luckin Coffee's stock. They also deemed such report credible on the basis that it was supported by over 11,000 hours of store traffic videos. Nonetheless, these allegations were categorically denied by Luckin Coffee. 2 months later, Luckin Coffee confessed to the scandal and convened an independent special committee to commence an internal investigation into the fraud. It was uncovered that management had fabricated RMB 2.2 billion in sales figures from Q2 to Q4 in 2019. This represented 47% of total revenues in that period. This also resulted in a nosedive of its stock price of 80%, wiping out $5 billion in market capitalization. At the end of post-scandal events, 2 delisting notices were received by Luckin Coffee in May 2020 and June 2020 respectively. This was because the company had failed to comply with annual report filing requirements. On the basis of public interest concerns, the trading of Luckin Coffee shares was eventually suspended on 30th June 2020. In February 2021, Luckin Coffee filed for bankruptcy due to being plagued by its ability to operate as a going concern. Following that, the company restated its financial statements for Q2 and Q3 of year 2019, revealing that management had inflated revenues by 38% and 83% respectively, with cost of goods sold and marketing expenses undergoing similar fraudulent treatments. Shockingly, initial Q3 profits of RMB 64 million, which were a major catalyst in its share price as it exhibited the profitability potential of its novel business model, was restated to a RMB 357 million loss. I will now hand my time over to Nigel, who will kickstart the ethical issues in this scandal.
Moving on, our group will be covering on the ethical issue involved during the scandals. And these are the three ethical issues we have identified. Firstly, the unethical corporate culture, followed by the fraudulent practices and failure in fulfilling directors' duties. Focusing on the first ethical issue, we will first determine whether the corporate culture empowered the employees to act ethically in a responsible way. Luckin Coffee was first founded with an ambitious vision to rival Starbucks and be part of everyone's everyday life, starting with coffee. Therefore, it adopted an aggressive expansion strategy and saw a rapid growth expansion with over 4,500 stores in China by 2019. However, this aggressive strategy raised many questions on the management decisions and actions, as it has ultimately affected the corporate culture. And before we go on to identify whether the corporate culture is ethical, we will first have to understand what is an ethical corporate culture. An ethical corporate culture is said to ensure that employees within the organization are empowered to act in an ethical, responsible way when the law is ambiguous during decision-making process, and to provide guidance when faced with ethical dilemma. In the case of Luckin Coffee, where the business handles high volume of transactions every day, employees within the organization are often likely to encounter with ambiguous situations that test their ethical judgment. Therefore, it is important to foster an ethical corporate culture, so as to guide employees in their decision-making process to act in an ethical way. Responsibility to foster an ethical corporate culture lies significantly with the tone at the top, as the top management are internally seen as the standard of acceptable conduct within the organization, as their behavior will be observed by the people at the bottom. Hence, they have a great influence on shaping the corporate culture. Furthermore, for top management to display ethical leadership, it can be identified through an articulation of values for the organization, like the mission statement or the code of conduct, where it serves as a fundamental principle which provides direction and set of rules when faced with ethical dilemmas. And throughout the period from 2017 to 2020, the top management displayed unethical leadership as they violated several code of business conduct set out in the company itself. This display of unethical leadership by the top management gradually became a norm within the company and created an unethical corporate culture in which the employees were not empowered to act ethically in a responsible way. Considering the corporate culture fostered by the top management to be unethical, we will look at the effects it brings onto different stakeholders. One key stakeholders affected by this culture will be the employees themselves. Over time, as unethical practices are being observed by the employees, these actions and behaviors gradually became a norm as it is being seen as the appropriate standards in the company. Therefore, it will affect the employees' ability to act in a responsible way, which ultimately led to the scandals itself. Secondly, the company itself also suffers from unethical corporate culture. When unethical practices surfaces, it reflects badly on the company itself and damages the company image and might deter potential investor and customer from the business. The company may also be faced with regulations and fines when breaching any unethical practices. Therefore, it will affect the company's overall financial health. In conclusion, Luckin's Coffee aggressive corporate culture combined with the unethical leadership displayed by the top management, it led to a compromised ethical environment. Without a robust ethical tone at the top, the organization struggles to empower employees to act responsibly, resulting in a negative outcome for both the company and the employees themselves.
The second ethical issue pertains to the fraud itself. Luckin has been under pressure to exceed Starbucks, but their real business performance was far from what it set out to do. Facing this difficult question, it is forced to contemplate fraud. We will use utilitarianism and principle-based ethics to understand this issue systematically. Firstly, let us try to justify the benefits of fraud from the management's perspective. The management's goal is to make profits, and Luckin was still at its early stages of growth and cash burning phase. However, it did not have enough cash, and so they had quite a problem on their hands, but there was a way out, and that is fraud. And fraud can bring in the precious capital they so desperately needed. But this is overly optimistic and does not consider the other stakeholders. For utilitarianism to be complete, one must consider the outcomes from all point of views. Firstly, let us backtrack a little and understand the fallout cost of fraud. Sources show that fraud costs companies on average about 100,000 USD per year or 5% of annual revenue. And in most cases, fraud is also uncovered within 12 months. So when fraud is discovered, the company also faces scalability impact, compliance costs, and loss of business. This hurt the bottom line of any profit-making company, let alone a loss-making company like Luckin, which is definitely not in the management's, shareholders, and creditors' favor. Furthermore, shareholders also suffer a loss in investor value, with share prices crashing at about 97%, which is almost 100% wipeout in investor value. For creditors, they also have given up hope for recovering any value of their loans to Luckin, especially since those loans used pledged Luckin shares as collateral, which are now worthless. Interestingly, the fraud also had global implications as well. As it turns out, there is now a heightened distrust towards Chinese companies, which coincided with the rising geopolitical tensions between the US and China. This means Chinese companies face greater scrutiny when trying to raise capital or obtaining audit-related services. Finally, the last stakeholder is the numerous employees who were left without a job in the wake of the scandal. Seeing these far-reaching effects, it is reasonable to say that fraud was unethical. But it is also quite difficult to quantify some of these effects, including the exact extent of distrust mounted on Chinese companies. So let us look at a more straightforward approach. Principle-based ethics. While the domains of law and ethics can be quite different, there is a baseline expectation to follow the law, and conducting fraud is not the way to do that. But the interesting thing is to consider if the accountants have breached their role to practice professional competence and due care. From what we understood, the accountants were mostly in the dark as they were working on a fraudulent database and they were none the wiser. Thus, in terms of breach of duty, it is more accurate to say that the management were the ones at fault here since they had went against the firm's mission. After all, the fraud nearly brought the company to a collapse. So based on utilitarianism and principle-based ethics, it provides us with an avenue to systematically deduce that a fraud is indeed unethical.
Next, we will move on to whether Luckin Coffee's marketing tactics were ethical. To recap on the key facts, Luckin Coffee's marketing was related to the equity offering and bond issuance in January 2020. Luckin Coffee obtained an equity and convertible offering from investors based on the fabricated financial performance, and this led to Luckin Coffee's stock price increasing by a whopping rate of 200% within 8 months of the IPO listing. Luckin Coffee's actions prompt us to consider whether the consent to exchange was really informed and ethical, or investors were deceived and manipulated into purchasing such financial instruments. From a principle-based ethics perspective, companies are expected to uphold moral duties like honesty and integrity, prioritizing these over short-term profits or competitive advantage. In this case, Luckin breached fundamental beliefs of Kantianism through the manipulation of performance metrics, which was a violation of the principles of honesty and truthfulness. From a libertarianism perspective, while businesses should be free to voluntarily seek profits, they should also do so in accordance to the law in a non-deceptive manner. However, Luckin pursued profits in a deceptive manner exemplified through their failure to be transparent. In short, the fraud was a result of the management being over-promising and over-delivering. We will delve deeper into the moral reasoning that might have led to the decision to commit fraud. Among these reasoning faults are overvaluing outcomes, ill-conceived goals, and normative myopia. In terms of overvaluing outcomes, Luckin Coffee inflated earnings to impress investors and obtain a good outcome while overlooking their unethical behavior. Secondly, Luckin Coffee also had ill-conceived goals as seen from the prioritization of sales volume over profitability to meet ambitious projections to secure funding. Lastly, the team involved in the fraud likely justified the fraud through normative myopia. The aggressive corporate culture and the pressing need to secure funding likely helped the team to rationalize the fraud as they over-prioritized short-term success and failed to consider the long-term costs.
I'll now be touching on the third and last ethical dilemma, which was if Luckin's board of directors were ethical in carrying out their duties, as well as evaluating if their actions, or inaction in this case, led to worsening of the fraud. Now, as a recap, most of the board directors were either part of Luckin Coffee's top management executives or had close ties with CEO Jenny and board chairman Charles. At time of listing, they also opted to not follow the listing guidelines, which required a majority of the board to be independent. Unfortunately, this led to a severe lack of board independence. Now, in assessing if the board was ethical in their actions, we'll be using two frameworks here, namely the duty and utilitarian framework. In terms of duties, our team found that the most applicable ones here are the duty of care and duty of loyalty. The duty of care states that directors must exercise reasonable care in ensuring that executives act according to the law and in the company's best interest. Now, in this case, this was severely breached, as Luckin's board likely knew about the fraud, considering that most of the management was on the board and yet did nothing to stop it. On the other hand, the duty of loyalty states that directors need to have undivided allegiance to the company and declare all possible conflicts of interest. As such, this was also breached as there were no notable instances of the non-independent directors abstaining themselves from any corporate decision-making processes. Next, from the utilitarian perspective, it might feel intuitive to argue that not having board independence and monitoring executives closely benefits more people, as it may lead to sounder, flexible, and faster decision-making, which benefits employees and customers. However, the downside to this is obvious. Should there be any wrongdoings, the board will be kept in the dark as well, or even slow to react, which may well worsen the risk. In this case, since they chose to not act on the fraud, this caused it to snowball and eventually led to the fallout and bankruptcy of Luckin, which caused more harm than good. In evaluation, we can see that using both the duty and utilitarian framework points us to the fact that the board was not ethical in carrying out its duties. However, the stakeholders involved definitely had their rationalizations. From the perspective of the board, it is likely that they chose to not interfere so as to not sour any working relationships with Jenny that have been cultivated since their time in UCAR. Moreover, the concept of overvaluing outcomes is particularly relevant here, as the board was too focused on the positive outcomes of the fraud, such as the high growth and share price appreciation. They felt that it was acceptable to not carry out their duties faithfully. Another plausible stakeholder is the Nasdaq listing board or regulators, who chose to approve of Luckin Coffee's listing despite knowing that their board was not fully independent. Now, in this case, it is likely due to them hoping to retain its competitiveness as a preeminent listing destination, and hosting such a world-famous brand's IPO, which was Luckin Coffee, is definitely crucial in helping them achieve that.
We have 3 recommendations to propose. Our first recommendation is to have improved internal controls, the first aspect of which involves the audit committee of companies. An audit committee is made up of independent directors, and it plays an important part in ensuring compliance. Apart from overseeing the company's financial reporting process and internal controls, they are the ones engaging external auditors and reviewing the results of the audit. Our team feels that with the immense influence of the audit committee, it has the power to place emphasis on 2 areas. Firstly, an IT audit aims to evaluate the effectiveness and robustness of a company's information systems. This can ensure data integrity and potentially detect the tampering, similar to Luckin's case. Next, an ethics audit reviews the company's code of ethics and discerns if the staff has adhered to it. This can help to detect unethical acts in the workplace. The second aspect of our recommendation involves the usage of biometrics. For the sales process, the recording of orders using customer biometrics can prevent falsified transactions and fictitious customers from being logged. This guarantees that the transactions are authentic. Biometrics can also be used to restrict access of resources to relevant staff who will only be able to access sensitive data based on their job scope. This will increase database security and prevent tampering. Our second recommendation is to cultivate a strong ethical corporate culture, which can be a powerful deterrent against unethical acts. Firstly, the management must lead the way with ethical leadership. Management must be seen by employees as ethical leaders, and they can encourage employees to actively apply ethical decision-making at the workplace. Next, an effective internal whistleblowing mechanism can be created. This provides employees with a safe avenue to bring unethical acts within the company to light. Of course, due process must be exercised to substantiate the claims and ensure that an impartial investigation takes place. Lastly, the company can appoint a chief ethics officer to improve and enforce the code of ethics and oversee the whistleblowing mechanism. Such an appointment will also show that the company places strong emphasis on ethical decision-making. Our third and final recommendation is for greater enforcement by government bodies. As gatekeepers and watchdogs, they have a professional duty to ensure that legislation can prevent market participants from breaking the law. While we acknowledge that they may not be in the best position to detect fraud, their primary role lies in deterrence with the use of legislation. To sum up, our team found that the chief reasons which resulted in Luckin Coffee's moral lapses and fraud were 1. Its unethical corporate culture, 2. Poor tone from the top, and 3. Failure of the board of directors in carrying out their duties. Nonetheless, there are few valuable lessons which we can take away from this case. Firstly, employees should always have a discerning view of corporate policies and culture, which includes blowing the whistle on unethical acts. Investors should always exercise due diligence and avoid being swayed by short-term market fanfare or misrepresentation by companies. Last but not least, regulators should constantly work to uphold the law and ensure that companies fulfill the necessary regulatory requirements before they are granted access to capital markets. With that, we come to an end. We conclude our presentation.